Welcome, everyone. We will get started in the next 60 seconds. Thank you for being here this afternoon and look forward to engaging. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Again, good afternoon. I hope you all are well from wherever it is that you're tuning in from. My name is Stefany Tomlinson, and I currently serve as the Assistant Director for Instructional Policy at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. It is my pleasure to serve as the moderator for today's discussion. Today's event is part of a series aimed at raising awareness around the imperative and opportunity of diversifying our educator workforce. At an event this past Tuesday, participants heard researchers and policymakers make the case for investment and action around a more representative workforce. Today, we're going to dive a bit deeper into one piece of the puzzle in actualizing this vision by reimagining how we think about educator evaluation practices. I am joined today by a researcher who will start our event by sharing findings from a study on the experience of classroom observations and evaluator judgments in North Carolina. This will be followed by a discussion with two educators who will share their own experience around evaluation and the conversations they've been a part of here in Massachusetts to think through a re-envisioned evaluation process. We also welcome and encourage you to use the chat and Q&A box to ask questions and engage throughout today's conversation. So it's my pleasure to introduce Olivia Chi. Olivia is an assistant professor at the BU Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. Her research uses quantitative methods to study the economics of education with a focus on teacher labor markets, measures of teacher quality, and policies that reduce educational inequality. She completed her PhD at Harvard University and holds a master's in education policy and management from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a bachelor's in economics and public policy from Brown University. Prior to these studies, she taught elementary grades in New Haven, Connecticut. So welcome, Olivia. We look forward to hearing more about your research, and I'll let you dive in and share more with us about what you found out.
Thank you so much. So thanks everybody for joining us today. And now we'll take a deeper dive into some of this research. So today I'll be discussing my paper, A Classroom Observer Like Me, the effects of race congruence and gender congruence between teachers and raters on observation scores. So just really quickly, a little bit of motivation behind this work. So over the past decade, US states and districts, they've really come to rely on teacher evaluations as a key lever for teacher accountability. And these classroom observations, they've really become the cornerstone of these post-No Child Left Behind teacher evaluation systems. These observations, these are typically conducted by administrators, so principals as well as assistant principals. And there's a growing body of research that's documented gaps in scores by race and gender. So what these studies have typically found are that white teachers receive higher scores than Black teachers, and female teachers receive higher scores than male teachers. And some of these studies even show that these gaps persist even after you account for other measures of teacher quality. So this naturally raises concerns about the source of the gaps. So at the end of the day, these classroom observation scores and evaluation scores, they're subjective ratings by administrators. And I argue that we need a better understanding of how race and gender dynamics are influencing these subjective judgments. So there's a small but growing body of work that suggests that these demographic matches between teachers and administrators can be important. So for today, I'll be discussing my findings from addressing this research question. What is the effect of race congruence and gender congruence between teachers and their raters on teachers' classroom observation scores? So to address this question, I'm using administrative data from a large school district in North Carolina from the school years 2013-14 through 2017-18. I have data from over 93,000 classroom observations. And so just so you know, in this context, there's a large population of Black teachers and white teachers. So those are the folks that are included in this analysis. And so to give you a little bit of context, the teachers in this district, they receive multiple rounds of classroom observations per school year. So 1 to 3 observations. And these teachers, they may be observed by different administrators across observation rounds. So they may be observed by their principal in round 1, they may be observed by their assistant principal in round 2. So I essentially take advantage of the setup to estimate these models, these fancy models with these different fixed effects. And essentially what that really means is just that I'm going to compare the scores that teachers get from a rater who matches them, let's say in race, to the scores that they get from a rater who doesn't match them. So for example, you could take the example, let's say a white teacher, I'm gonna compare the score that they get from a white rater and compare that to a score that they get from a Black rater. And similarly for Black teachers, I'm gonna compare the scores that they get from their Black administrator and compare that to the scores that they get from a white administrator. And in these fancy models, I'm also accounting for differences in the observer's characteristics. So you might imagine that, some principals, they might be harsher raters than others. They might even be differentially harsh, let's say in round 1, where they might go a little bit easier on teachers, even compared to round 3, where they might be a little harsher. So the models that I'm using, the analytics, they try to account for all these differences across different administrators, these different raters. And so what do I find? So first, I'll walk through some of my results for race matching. So what I'm finding is that teachers on average, they experience a pretty small but positive increase in their observation scores from sharing race with their observer. And so you see this number on the screen, 0.03 standard deviations. What does that mean? So to try to put that into context, the 0.03, it's about 10% of the average growth in observation scores that a typical first year teacher makes between their first year and their second year. It's about 10% of that growth. So it is small, but it is meaningful. Then next, I try to examine to what degree do we think that this benefit of sharing race, does it seem to be similar across Black teachers and white teachers? And what I find are that in my models, I come up with these similar point estimates, and it's just some suggestive evidence that the magnitude of the benefit from sharing race, it's comparable for Black teachers and for white teachers. So I next turn to the results from what are the effects of sharing gender with your observer. And I also find that teachers on average, they experience a small positive increase in their scores from sharing gender with their observer. When I look at it separately for men and for women, I also find these similar point estimates. These aren't definitive by any means, but it is at least a little bit suggestive that we think that both men and women are benefiting from sharing gender with their classroom observers. And so what are the implications for the magnitude of these race and gender gaps that I was talking about? So in this context, like in many that have been studied before, white and female teachers, they are receiving higher observation scores than their Black and male peers. And the results that I found, it suggests that the Black-white observation score gap, it's smaller when Black observers rate teachers as compared to when white observers rate teachers. And similarly, the male-female observation score gap, it's smaller when male observers rate teachers as compared to when female observers rate teachers. And so taking this all together, finding that these teachers experience these small positive effects on their scores from demographic matching, I argue that it disadvantages teachers whose race and gender identities aren't reflected by any of their raters. And so you can imagine these dynamics exist in other portions of the pipeline as well. So I urge that future work should also investigate these race and gender dynamics at other decision points in the teacher pipeline. For example, in hiring, you could imagine that these dynamics are happening when principals are evaluating candidates in demo lessons. You could imagine that there's the potential for these dynamics to exist in promotions to leadership positions, as well as contract renewals. So I really think this is an important avenue for future work. So thank you all. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And I'll turn it back to Stefany.
Thank you, Olivia. Wow. I'm just blown away by your research findings, and I'm looking forward to discussing more about them. I'd love to welcome Sara Marie, Jette, and Stephen Moguel to just share their reactions to these research findings before we engage in that larger Q&A discussion together. And before we move into their reactions, I'd love to just share a little bit more about them. Sara Marie is a semi-finalist for the 2022 Massachusetts Teacher of the Year and teaches at the Thompson School in Arlington. She has taught 5th grade and 4th grade and will move down to 3rd grade in September. She's also the author of an award-winning children's book, What the Wind Can Tell You. She's the mother of 3 kids and 4 cats and looks forward to a summer of reading and writing. Stephen is currently the principal at William G. Morgan Elementary Full Service School in the Holyoke Public School System. He started his education career in 2007 as a teaching assistant for 6th to 8th grade with a focus on supporting special education students. After receiving his master's, he taught 4th grade for 2 years at a charter school, then transitioned back into a public school as a 6th grade teacher. Both Sara Marie and Stephen are members of this year's Massachusetts Principal and Teacher Advisory Cabinet, a body of educators selected to engage and advise the Department of Education on issues critical to teaching and learning in the Commonwealth. So welcome, Sara and Stephen. Sara Marie, we'll start off with you, just sharing your reactions to the findings that Olivia shared with us today.
Thank you. The study was really interesting for me when I was reading it, and it made me think a lot about how, as a teacher, I'm expecting to be evaluated when I'm being observed on how I'm teaching to the standards and teaching all learners and how I work with families. But this study shows that my identity is also something that's part of the observation. And I teach in a school that is very diverse with student population, but I'm the only classroom teacher of color in my school and been there for 13 years. There've been 2 other classroom teachers of color who've only stayed for 1 year. So it made me think about how the observation plays a huge role in evaluation and what role does this have? And my school has grown. It was 2 classroom teachers of each grade and each grade level to 4, with the exception of 1 grade that's a little bit smaller. But when I was also thinking about in schools where there isn't a lot of staff diversity, how is the observation of me as a woman of color different from when they're observing so many of my white colleagues? And it just raised a lot of questions. One of the things we talked about in PAC-TAC with the having culturally responsive teaching as part of our evaluations to come, we also talked a lot about what administrators understood. What is culturally responsive teaching? How is that shown? And some teachers of color had concerns about how, just concerns about how our teaching might be seen as different from other people. That we had some, there is concern with that. I think thinking about teaching culturally responsive teaching as a person of color feels a little bit different than just the regular standard. So this one had a hyper focus. But after reading this study, it made me think about my interactions in general as a woman of color. It's always there. And then the one quickly, because I could talk for a while on this, the part about the hiring, the promotions really stood out to me. A few years ago, I spoke to an administrator about down the road, maybe moving on to a coaching position. It's my last day of school and I'll cry if I think about it. I'm not ready to leave the classroom, but maybe one day I might. And the person I spoke to, the administrator, talked about how they look at grade level range. That's really important because you could be a K1-2 coach or a 3-4-5 coach. So that's a good thing to have, as well as certifications and degrees. But the other thing this administrator said, which is a really big part of it, is your personality and your presentation. And that makes you think, and there was, so that is, if that's a big deciding factor, it's something that gives pause, because what this study shows is that when there's race congruence and gender congruence, there's a bump, and then there is the scores go down when there isn't, and it's something that it's concerning. I'm going to stop because I could keep going.
No, we welcome that, Sarah Marie. Thank you for sharing those initial insights. I'm curious, Stephen, your response, possibly to some things that Sarah Marie shared, or even your own reactions to these findings, especially with your perspective as a principal.
Sure, thank you. I find it really thought-provoking and intriguing. Obviously, given the context that I'm a Black male and the majority of my staff are white female teachers. And this year, there's been a concerted effort for me to really bring in more teachers of color. We serve 90% Latinx population, predominantly Puerto Rican, just in my building. And it's interesting because I don't want to challenge the study because I believe it to be true, but I find that maybe I've noticed, personally speaking, that I'm tougher on my teachers of color because there's an inherent understanding that there's more placed on them. There's kind of an understanding that they need to have without me having to talk about it. I think there's a larger onus on teachers of color to really get through to students of color. So it made me think about that. But then in listening and reading the article or reading the research, reflecting on my observations, I do notice the disparity in how I rate the teachers of color versus the conversations I have with them. And so the conversations are much more direct, much more around race congruence in regards to what's the onus and responsibility on you versus white female teachers where there's almost this idea of you may take some time to get it, where I tell teachers of color, you don't get time to get it. Like you don't have time to get it, you just have to get it immediately. So I think that's really thought provoking. And sitting on the opposite end, it makes me think about how am I evaluating white female teachers and what are my maybe inherent biases that I may have, and starting to pull back and really thinking about what is the true criteria of culturally responsive teaching. I think, Sara Marie, when you talk about that, and we talked about this on Pack Attack, the idea that what is the actual criteria? How is that determined statewide? How is that determined district-wide? And I think about in the work that I'm doing in my building, and obviously as part of Pack Attack, that's something we believe in. But at the district level, I don't think that's representative. And so it's clearly subjective around culturally responsive teaching in my building because that's what we prioritize. But if you go to a different building in our district, that's not what we prioritize, and that's not something we factor in. So how do we normalize that? How do we standardize that? And how does that truly play a part in the evaluation process, and really make it objective versus subjective? I'll stop here because I can also talk about forever.
Well, we're going to keep the party going. I'm going to invite Olivia back with us so we can officially kind of move into a more informal Q&A section. So I don't see any questions right now from our attendees, but I do encourage you at any point while we're having a conversation, please use the chat to share your reactions. Please ask questions. We love to engage with you and hear your thoughts about this fascinating topic. But I will kick us off, Olivia. There was so much, I think, so many gems just dropped right now between Stephen and Sara Marie, and wondering if you had any insights to some of the points they shared about, or any reactions of your own to hearing their reactions to the research.
So first, I just want to thank both Sara Marie and Stephen for your thoughts after reading the paper. Like, it's very helpful to try to frame this in terms of real person's experiences. Like I have this large data set, but thinking about the individuals who are potentially making up this data set is very helpful. And I very much hear your concerns, and these are, I think, at least in terms of like where I'm coming from and where I'm standing in terms of where I think the research needs to go, is to dig deeper into the mechanisms. So like in my research study, like I show that there are these effects for race matching. I show that there are these effects for gender matching, but it doesn't, like the data that I'm using doesn't tell me why. And I would urge researchers, anybody else, to try to think about what are the potential mechanisms at play here. Is it how the raters are thinking about culturally responsive teaching or not thinking about culturally responsive teaching? I think trying to unpack what are these effects and what are the benefits that, let's say, a majority white female workforce tends to get from having matches with their raters. Like, what are those benefits and what's causing them that some teachers are getting that maybe teachers of color or underrepresented teachers aren't getting? And so I really I'm really grateful to hear what your concerns are and how you see yourself in your roles, because I think having more of those conversations will help push us forward into thinking about how we can begin to unpack the mechanisms behind these findings. So thank you, I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Olivia. And I think one question that I have for each of you is, given the findings that Olivia shared and even your own personal experiences in schools, I wonder what each of you would recommend we do differently in terms of our evaluation processes, especially since we now know there are disparities in the way that process is being carried out now. Like, what do you recommend as we think about a re-envisioned process for educator evaluation? What are some ways that we might see that process reimagined or re-envisioned?
My school a few years back we had some unconscious bias training that was really helpful on a school-wide. I worked with some colleagues and got a grant for this program at my school. But I don't think it's a one and done. I think it's something that the conversations need to continue. And I think conversations are so important. Stephen, what you said about like being harder on your teachers of color, that really held true to me, because I feel like since I remember what it was like being the only kid of color in an all-white school and how hard that was. So like I'm think about the child that I was, and I'm a big advocate for my kids, but then other coworkers are still understanding what this means. And I think administrators have a lot on their plates, especially this past year, that administrators, oh my goodness. I mean, you didn't have a summer vacation and you're still, I mean, you administrators have had a lot to deal with, but seeing how there is so much that's subjective, it's really thinking about that. So it's not just going in and observing, but it's also thinking about all the things that aren't part of the evaluation process, not just part of the things you're looking at on the paper. What else is there that's not being spoken or said out loud? And just having an awareness. I think having an awareness is the first step, and then working to question your biases as you uncover them.
I think something that resonates with me was the work we were doing in Pack and Tack and talking about those focus indicators. So I think that's a step in the right direction. I would add on, in addition to that, where we've talked a lot about this the subjectivity is like, what are the artifacts and evidence that we're asking teachers to hand in? So how do we normalize that? Because I know I ask for specific things, and how is that representative of culturally responsive teaching, right? Like, how do you quantify that or qualify it? So I think, how does that ring true throughout the whole state, right? What would be an example in standard one of culturally responsive teaching that would want a teacher to hand to me? And that should be the example from district to district. So how do we begin to get to that place to make it more objective? Because I think that helps to lift the work, but to really have clear understanding of what is it to be culturally responsive, what is it to put it into practice, and how does that resonate with students, or student-driven outcomes.
One additional thought that I had about the process is, I recognize that, race and gender and how raters are assigned to teachers, like there are many considerations, one of which can be, strengths and weaknesses, which type of person do you want giving feedback to somebody else, and like those dynamics when it comes to like actual teaching practices. But one thought is perhaps having some consideration for what combination of administrators are observing that teacher. If there is diversity among the administrators in race and gender, is there a way so that teachers are exposed to like the diversity of those administrators, and just so that there's opportunity for different voices to come into the process, so that when the opportunity allows, there's that possibility of benefit for that teacher, particularly if they're underrepresented. And I think the other thought process is thinking about how do we diversify the administrators who are in our workforce, and so that this this process is beneficial to underrepresented teachers as well. And so thinking about the big picture of that pipeline, I think is also another long-term consideration.
Could I add on or respond to something you just said that just actually you made me think about something I want to do this summer. So my assistant principal is a white female, and my coach, our coach, is a Puerto Rican female who went through the school district system we work for. And so I'd be interested to pull all of our observation and feedback and think about what are the things that we're saying and how do we rate against each other compared to different teachers? Because I wonder if that plays a role. I would have to imagine it does. So it's interesting to have a Black male, because we do have a diverse leadership staff, like Black male, Puerto Rican female of color, and then a white female. And so what does that look like? How do we rate? And if we were to compare the teachers, because we've all observed all the teachers, how would that stack against each other? What would that look like? That's a very interesting and thought-provoking idea for me to ponder on this summer.
And then thinking like down the road with that, how are you retaining underrepresented teachers versus districts that may not have that same diversity in administration to observe? So I like that a lot. That sounds great.
Well, we have just about 60 seconds before we wrap up. I also thought it was pretty fascinating that we're pairing the conversation about educator evaluation alongside diversifying the workforce and thinking about how we're not only getting talented, diverse educators in our schools and leaders in our schools, but also retaining them. And so it's interesting to think about what type of environments we're creating for those educators through our systems, through our processes, and ensuring that they're culturally responsive, such as educator evaluation. Before I move us to closing out, I just want to leave the floor open for any last thoughts or comments that either of you would like to share with our attendees, or insights that you have for them, or gems you want to drop. We'll leave space for that before I wrap this up.
I am just very grateful for this study. It's something I'm going to be passing on throughout my district, just something to bring up for the leadership team and the school council with my administrator. And it was very thought-provoking. So thank you so much for this research.
Similar, I appreciate just the opportunity to dig into this. I would just share with everyone, the work comes from teachers. I think teachers, if you push administrators, I think that sets the stage for what we prioritize. So for me, I think, what we do or what we pay attention to is what matters in a school building, right? And administrators generally set the tone. So this, I think, really matters. And so how do you bring that forward, not only to buildings, but to districts? This is something I want to bring to my district, and to really think about how we being objective in the work and how we retaining teachers of color and diversifying the workforce.
Well, thank you all. I really appreciated, Olivia, you just sharing your fascinating research, and then Sara Marie and Stephen, you both sharing your perspective. I will move us to officially closing out for today in terms of next steps. So I would love to start by just sharing some ways to stay engaged. All registrants will receive a follow-up email with these details, but we want to be explicit about the ways that you can take action now and stay engaged around issues of educator diversity. The first is that there's a proposed legislation in the House and Senate right now that seeks to make more explicit the policies and investments that need to be in place to cultivate and sustain a more diverse workforce. Review the legislation and consider talking about it with your representatives. The second thing you can do is get your copy of the Teacher Diversity and Student Success book. Anyone who is registered is automatically entered to win one of 5 copies, and we'll be in touch with the lucky winners in the coming days. But by attending, you are also eligible to receive a discount code for purchasing a copy of the book as well. And then the last thing you can do to stay engaged is that DESE is actively advancing many of the efforts we talked through today and has opportunities for educators to engage alongside them in those efforts. check out our Amazing Educators page and consider becoming an Inspire Fellow or a member of the Principal and Teacher Advisory Cabinets, as Sara Marie and Stephen have joined and participated in this year. And so with that, I conclude our time together. Thank you all for attending and continuing to keep teacher diversity a commitment and a priority. And we hope you have a great rest of your afternoon and take care. Bye-bye.